Hi all. I want to talk to you today about the Elaboration Likelihood Model from Chapter 7 in your textbook. The Elaboration Likelihood Model, or ELM as I'll call it today, was presented by Petty and Cacioppo in 1981. They also had a publication in 1986 that is considered pretty seminal and foundational to this research. The ELM is a theory of attitude change. So unlike the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior that I talked to you about recently, this theory really targets attitudes. The theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior ultimately targeted actual behavior change. And one of the ways to get to behavior change is to go through attitudes. If you recall, attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, at least according to the theory of planned behavior, are all predictive of behavioral intentions, which are then predictive of actual behavior. So attitudes are certainly a part of that process. But what TRA and TPB want to do is get at actual behavior change. What the ELM wants to do is get at attitude change. Now, as we've talked about several times already, we think and hope that attitude change will lead to behavior change, and a lot of times it does, sometimes it doesn't. But Petty and Cacioppo really wanted to target attitude change with the elaboration likelihood model. This is, as your book indicates, a dual process model of attitude change. The heuristic systematic model by Eagley and Chaikin, Perloff talks about that a little bit in your book, doesn't focus much on that. That is because the elaboration likelihood model is a very similar model, as you'll see once you do your readings or listen to me talk about the ELM today. And the elaboration likelihood model has been a much more successful theory. It's been a much more heuristic theory. Heuristic can mean a couple of things. In the context of the ELM, it can mean a shortcut. When I say heuristic in terms of a theory, it means researchers and scholars have really done a lot of studies with it. The HSM, the heuristic systematic model, has not sparked nearly as much research as the ELM has, so it seems to be a much more popular, much more valid model. But both are dual process models. The ELM says that two different kinds of persuasion processes can be activated for individuals, and that depends on the degree to which the target is willing to engage in systematic thinking about the issue relevant thinking, also called elaboration. That's the heart of the elaboration likelihood model. According to Petty and Cacioppo, attitude change, again the target of this model, can and does often occur via one of two processing routes. I don't want to confuse you with that language. Petty and Cacioppo would also say that these two routes are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And by that I mean it's not necessarily the case that an individual will follow only one of these routes to persuasion. One of them tends to be activated more than the other, particularly when we're talking about the central root and motivation to centrally process or really elaborate on a message. And depending on some of that, it's more or less likely that you're going to take one of these routes. But I do want to emphasize that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Elements of both of these things, both peripheral cues and central cues, can contribute to the attitude change process. So I want to be clear about that right away. The two routes that ELM proposes, again, are the central root and the peripheral root. The central root entails vigilant consideration of the persuasive message, whatever message that the target is being faced with. Individuals, when we're considering whether they're going to process centrally, they really do focus a lot on both the message position, the position that is taken in the message, and the argument quality or argument strength. When I talk about message position, I mean whether the message that the target is hearing is pro-attitudinal or not. It could be counter-attitudinal, it could be pro-attitudinal. People are more likely to elaborate on or to centrally process a message that is pro-attitudinal, which means that agrees with pre-existing attitudes that they already have. They are sometimes less likely to centrally process or really cognitively elaborate on a message that is counter-attitudinal, a message that does not necessarily take their particular position. Now, that's not always true. There certainly are exceptions to that, just like there are exceptions to any rule, but that's a generality. In terms of argument quality, we mean argument strength. People who are processing centrally are really elaborating on a message. That's what central root processing means. And they're paying really close attention to the source, the persuasive message source, and the strength of the arguments that they are making to try to get attitude change. If you're thinking hard, if you're processing centrally, you're really elaborating, and the source of the persuasive message is delivering some really weak messages, you're motivated to think hard about them, but in thinking hard about them, you realize how terrible they are, and they're certainly not likely to convince you. They're certainly not likely to engender actual attitude change. So while we certainly want people to process centrally a lot of the time as a source of a persuasive message, if you think that your audience may be processing centrally as a source who is delivering a persuasive message, you better make sure you have good arguments or this whole thing will backfire. Now, a couple of factors indicate influence whether or not people are actually able and motivated to process centrally or not. Certain factors and conditions have to be in place to really get people to do that. And those are motivation and ability factors. Motivation is the desire to engage in issue relevant elaboration, really systematic, vigilant consideration of the messages that you're getting. Ability then is the capability to do that. It's one thing to be motivated, it's another thing to be able. It's one thing to be able, but it's a different thing to be motivated. It is ideal when a target has both of these, has both motivation and ability to process centrally. Some of the things that factor into whether or not people will be motivated are how involved they are with the topic, with the persuasive topic, with the issue, as I keep saying. Involvement has been shown over the last few decades to be a really key variable in persuasion. If you don't have a target who is involved with the topic of your persuasive message, the issue, the messages that you're delivering, it is very difficult to get either attitude or behavior change. Involvement simply means, do you perceive this issue as personally relevant and salient to you? Do you care about this? If this is something that is not personally relevant to you, then you probably don't care about it. That means you're not involved with the topic. That means you're very unlikely to centrally process a message. If you do care about the topic, if you do perceive it as personally relevant and salient to you, then you probably do care about the topic. And that is an excellent, what I would call a necessary, but maybe not sufficient condition to encourage you to centrally process. Involvement, again, outside of the ELM, across all types of different persuasive and compliance gaining endeavors has really been shown to be a key variable. Need for cognition is also an important variable in terms of motivation to process centrally. Need for cognition is the extent to which people like thinking and they like thinking hard about things. Need for cognition is an individual difference variable, which means it varies based on the person that we're dealing with. Some of us are higher in need for cognition, some of us are lower. It's pretty stable though. So if you are high in need for cognition now, you were probably high 10 years ago and you'll probably be high 10 years from now. If you're low, that's probably going to be pretty stable as well. Now, a quick point, need for cognition and intelligence or being smart are not the same. They're correlated, but they're not exactly the same thing. People can be intelligent and still have low need for cognition, which means I'm smart, but I can't say that I really enjoy thinking hard about things. And of course, the opposite can be true too. A certain level of intelligence certainly helps in terms of need for cognition. It helps in terms of thinking and deciphering information and interpreting information, all of that, but they're not necessarily the same thing. But need for cognition, just like high involvement, both increase the motivation to centrally process. Now, a quick note here. Those two variables, involvement with the topic and need for cognition, have been studied most in terms of the key factors that increase motivation to centrally process. You notice I've got another couple of factors here that influence motivation that are not covered in your textbook. I want to be very clear in saying that while there is some research on both number of sources presenting arguments and emotional state and their effect on motivation, there is not nearly the amount of research that we have on involvement with the topic and need for cognition. Those are really the two key variables that influence motivation to centrally process. And those two don't seem to work equally well. If there is a discrepancy, for example, between involvement with the topic and need for cognition, and by that I mean if you are really involved with the topic, so you have high involvement with the topic, but your need for cognition is low, that's probably still going to be enough to motivate you to centrally process. On the other hand, if your need for cognition is high, but your involvement with the topic is low, you just don't care about it, despite the fact that you have high need for cognition, that is probably not going to be enough to motivate you to centrally process. What you should take from that is really involvement is the key variable here. If we can get people involved with the topic, if we can communicate to them how it's salient, how it matters to them, they are much more likely to centrally process. Other variables matter too. There really are a host of these that you could find. Here are a couple that I see crop up a decent amount. The number of sources presenting arguments. If you hear especially the same argument from more than one source, and particularly if that source has, say, credibility for you, then you are going to be more motivated generally to centrally process than if you just hear the persuasive message from one source. That's a finding that we see somewhat frequently. Emotional state has also been linked to individuals' motivation to process. And I think the results here are a little bit counterintuitive. There's not a lot of research on this, but the bit of research that we have suggests that being in a happy mood, feeling really positive, actually decreases your motivation to centrally process. When we are feeling happy, we don't really want anything to interfere with that. We don't want to think hard about the message because that might bring us down. If we are in a more negative emotional state, like anger, for example, we seem to be more likely, more motivated to centrally process. So emotional state matters. Again, we do not have as much research on number of sources or emotional state as we do on involvement or need for cognition, but I thought I would mention them. Those aren't mentioned in the book, and you will see some research on them. It's not just about motivation, of course, it's about ability. You can have all the motivation in the world, but if you do not have the capacity to centrally process, it's not going to matter. Ideally, you have both. Presence of distractions and knowledge of the topic, prior knowledge of the topic, are the two key variables that have been associated with ability to centrally process. Again, I have a couple more at the bottom: repetition of the message and clarity and comprehensibility, but we don't have as much research on those. Again, the two key variables are presence of distraction and knowledge of the topic, and those just make sense. They're kind of a given. If you are distracted, then no matter how motivated you are to listen to and elaborate on a persuasive message, you're probably not going to be able to do that if there are a number of distractions in the area or as you're listening to the source of the persuasive message. So that matters. Prior knowledge of the topic also would matter as well. It's easier for us to centrally process a message if we have some prior knowledge of the topic. If this is something that I don't know anything about, then it is very difficult for me, even if I want to centrally process a message, to even figure out what's a good message and what's not. I need to have some level of prior familiarity with the issue in order to have the ability to centrally process. So that matters. A couple of other things that we think may matter are repetition of the message. Repetition has been looked at quite a bit in the social influence context, with regard to persuasion in particular. Oftentimes, usually, in fact, a little repetition will work in your favor. It's the same premise that teachers use when they repeat a lot of their messages during lecture. You may not get it the first time because you might be distracted, not paying attention, maybe you just miss it. But if I say it more than once, then you're likely to catch it on at least one of those passes. Sort of the same idea with the persuasive message. A little bit of repetition works in your favor. Notice I say a little bit. Too much repetition of a persuasive message will actually work against you. Think about how this works in real life. Think about a commercial that you see on TV too many times, or a jingle that you hear on the radio repeatedly, and it starts to annoy you. And instead of really paying close attention to it, you stop paying attention to it at all. It either annoys you or you discount it completely. That's too much repetition. If you're repeating your persuasive message that much as a source, then you've lost the advantage of repetition in increasing ability to centrally process. So you want a little bit of repetition, but not too much. There's certainly a ceiling effect for repetition. And that, of course, begs the question, well, how much is too much? Well, what am I looking for? That varies so widely according to the topic, according to people's prior knowledge of the topic, according to just a host of variables. Some persuasive scholars have given a rule of thumb for repeating something 3 times, but that's a generality. I would take that with a real grain of salt. We're not sure exactly how many times you need to repeat it, but some repetition is good. It's also true that the clarity and the comprehensibility of the persuasive message matters in terms of your ability to process it centrally. That makes sense. If you have a disorganized message, a message that's confusing, a message that uses a lot of jargon, even if you want to think hard about it, you may not be able to, but you may be caught up in those aspects of the message that make it unclear to you. This is a form of noise. We talk about noise interfering with the communication situation, preventing a message from getting to the target in the way you want it to get to them, or preventing them from understanding understanding it. Clarity and comprehensibility will introduce some noise into the process that make it difficult, if not impossible, for people to centrally process. So you want to make sure you have an organized, clear message that doesn't use jargon, that speaks to your audience in a way that will make sense to them. Now, a note, you don't have to have all of these factors to have both motivation and ability, but of course, the more that you have, we think, the more both motivation and ability will be increased. It does seem that you need some element of both motivation and ability to be able to centrally process, so certainly both of these are important. Now, lots of times folks do not centrally process. As you might imagine, the ELM focuses a lot on central root processing because, quite honestly, we want people to process centrally. We're always looking for ways to get them to process centrally, again, especially if we have a really strong persuasive message. But the fact is, a lot of times people do not. Peripheral route processing can work too, though. I mean, it can engender persuasion. Either processing by central root or peripheral root can actually get persuasion. I want to make that clear. Petty and Cacioppo have been very clear about that. Their argument is not that the only way to persuasion is through the central root. They know peripheral root processing can work too. With the peripheral root processing, we are not motivated to vigilantly, systematically consider the message and engage in a whole lot of elaboration or issue relevant thinking. Here, we are really paying attention to heuristics or shortcuts or some kind of cue in the environment that is a heuristic or a shortcut. And lots of times we're doing this. Stroh was one of the first to write about people generally being cognitive misers, which means we are miserly about the amount of cognitive attention we're willing to focus on most things. We simply cannot centrally process every single message that we come into contact with. We can't. We don't have the brain capacity for that. It would take up too much of our day. We are only really motivated to centrally process certain things, not everything. Most things are processed peripherally because they can be. It's easy to rely on cues and to get you where you need to be, basically. So the fact that people are cognitive misers means that most people are going to peripherally process. So thank goodness attitude change can be gotten in that way. But it also means you're going to have to work extra hard to get people to process centrally if that's what you want them to do. Now, what kinds of shortcuts or heuristics or cues are we talking about? Virtually anything can serve as a cue that might trigger or engender peripheral route processing. I'll talk about a few here that are the most commonly seen in research. One of those is the credibility of the source delivering the persuasive message. If you believe that the source is credible, if you're convinced by that in some way, then sometimes we think, well, I don't really need to think very hard about what they say. I know this person is an expert. I know they're smart. I know they're trustworthy, so I'm just going to believe them. It's that simple. Liking for the persuasive source matters too in a very similar way that credibility does. If I like you, there's there's always been a similarity attraction principle present in the literature. And it means that the more similar I think we are, the more I like you, basically. So if we like the source of a persuasive message, one of the things that we perceive usually is that they're a lot like you. Well, you're like me. If this is how you feel, then maybe I should feel this way too. And we might be persuaded by something that is that cue-like in nature. Physical attractiveness on the part of the source of the persuasive message also matters and can serve as a peripheral cue. Physical attractiveness in terms of persuasion can be a double-edged sword, like so many things can be. Just like there is a ceiling effect for repetition of the message, there's a ceiling effect for the physical attractiveness of the source too. Lots of times having a physically attractive source can work in your favor. One of the things it does is it serves as a cue. It can trigger this peripheral route processing where if I am an attractive source, if you perceive me to be an attractive source, you might not listen that hard to what I have to say, but you're going to be convinced by it anyway. But of course, you can be too attractive, just like you can have too much repetition of a message. And when that happens, perceptions of your credibility, perceptions of your intelligence, in fact, start to go down. And in that case, it may not be an instance in which that particular source is able to engender attitude change. So a little bit of attraction is good. Too much is probably going to work against you. Attraction affects particularly female persuasive sources too, according to the literature. A little bit less of an effect for males. The same effect is seen, but the effect is less strong for males than it is for females. It's also true that other people's reactions to a persuasive message, if you're aware of those, can serve as a cue to encourage you to process a message peripherally. So if you're in a room, for example, with a bunch of people listening to a persuasive message, and maybe you're not really paying attention, you're on your phone, you're messing around, but you see people nodding in the audience. You look around, lots of people are doing that. Strength in numbers, right? You might think, well, all these people were listening. They agree. Probably something I should do too. Sure. Attitude changed. Some of that won't necessarily lead to long-term effects. For me, that's the problem with the peripheral route processing. It's true that you can get attitude change through the peripheral route or you can get it through the central route. That's true. But to me, the quality of the attitude change is different. Not just to me, research backs me up on this. While you can get attitude change through the peripheral route, it is true that attitudes that are changed via central route processing are more persistent, they're more resistant to counter persuasion, and they are more likely to actually eventually impact a person's behavior than is attitude change that is gotten through the peripheral route. If you recall from a previous lecture, I talked about sort of the gold standard of persuasion research, and that if you get persuasion, if you can get some attitude change, we want that attitude change to be persistent. We want it to be enduring. We want it to resist counter persuasion influences, and obviously we want it to impact behavior. We find that attitude change through the central route versus the peripheral route is much more likely to have those effects. And so we see it as sort of a higher quality attitude change, if you will. Again, I want to emphasize that the two routes are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We can be convinced. So it may be you are first cued by a peripheral cue, like the credibility of a source, and you think this source is credible. Maybe that's something that encourages you then to really pay close attention to the message. And then it becomes about considering the message for you and less about basic cues of the source then. So they can work together in that way. But again, lots of times people are taking one of two routes or more likely to take one route than another. And again, I would argue the central route processing leads to more effective attitude change than the peripheral route processing.